Let me introduce our guest this week, Ryan Nakade. And I'll just tell you where I first ran into Ryan. You all know that I'm very interested in bridge building and how do you bridge the divide and how do we actually become peacemakers. And, I've developed a training and a curriculum on all that. So I'm very, very interested. And I was listening to a broadcast and they were discussing strategies that you could use. And one of the strategies that people often use in navigating this is called steel manning. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, but it's where you basically try to make the argument of your opponent as best you possibly can and, you know, make it the steel. And Ryan had said, I want to do titanium manning. And what he described was, I want to bring so much love and care about the other person into the process that I want to make the other person's argument better than they do. And I thought that was so intriguing that he really wanted to go an extra mile in understanding the perspectives of people he debated. And then Ryan and I just reached out to him cold and we became friends and then colleagues, and we've worked on a number of projects together. And he practices what he preaches. One of the things that really intrigued me is it's very hard to engage what I would call extremist groups, and whether it's from the right or the left. Well, Ryan is a national expert in doing that. He has done that. I don't know if he's going to be speaking about that in his comments, but he's worked with the most extreme groups and he's found ways to de-escalate violence in some of the worst situations. So he's uh, a talented practitioner, um, deeply spiritual in that he wants the best for the other person. His mother is actually a Buddhist priest, and so you can see that in him. And he's also quite brilliant, and he's been incredibly helpful to the cultural translation program. I know he has spoken with this group, if people remember, just I think a year ago or maybe more. So it's great to have you back, Ryan, and we're curious to hear what you're working on. And I loved catching up with you in person when we were in Portland. So Ryan Nakade, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rich, for such a generous introduction. And yeah, Rich and Katerina, thank you so much for inviting me back. And great to see all of you again. I remember seeing some familiar faces, Ross, yeah, last year. So it's great to be here with all of you again. So today's talk, we're calling the virtue of disagreement. And I'll just share a little bit about myself and my background. So my professional background and training is in mediation and conflict resolution. And part of mediation and conflict resolution, actually all of mediation and conflict resolution, is about asking people questions to uncover what their underlying values and interests are, and then helping the parties in conflict reach an agreement that they both sign off on so that they can do something actionable that fulfills everyone's interests and needs. But what I often think about is, what about situations where agreement is not possible? When people might be willing to try to work out a conflict or try to work out a disagreement, but there just is no option, there's no availability to actually converge on any common ground or shared interest. And so what I often think about is, what do we do in those kinds of situations? And although this is not a part of mediation, at least not explicitly, I've been thinking about it as, how do we grow as individuals? How do we use conflict and disagreement as an opportunity to build our character, to be able to tolerate differences, and to be more resilient in these types of situations? So the idea is that our attention, which is normally focused outward, focused on the other person, focused on how we communicate, focused on identifying common points of interest, what happens if we start to turn that energy and attention inwards and focusing on ourselves and how we can personally grow spiritually and psychologically and cultivate that virtue and virtuous qualities by approaching disagreement in a new way, right? So virtuous qualities, we're thinking about it as things like patience, right? Empathy, compassion, self-awareness, self-insight. And I think what's empowering about this framework is that you're not dependent upon whether you reach an agreement or not, right? We're not dependent on the other person changing their behavior or changing their approach in a way that satisfies us, right? Regardless of the outcome externally, we can still benefit and grow internally. And so that's kind of the inspiration behind this talk. And then we'll go through a few more, and then I'd love to open it up and hear from all of you and see what y'all are thinking. So I want to ask everyone to think about a magical experience you've had in your life. Well, what have been some magical times that you've experienced, right? So for some people, it's watching your child being born. As a goat herder and goat farmer, watching one of my goat kids being born, the first goat kid we had, Taco, was a magical experience for me. For other people, it might be going on a amazing hike in the mountains or something like that. So when my wife and I went hiking up some of these beautiful, incredible Alp Alp-like mountains in Washington State. That was a really transformative and magical experience to see how beautiful all of these mountains and rivers and lakes were and forests were. But there's another type of magical experience I want to share with y'all that I get the privilege of experiencing regularly, and that I've experienced a lot in my previous job that Rich was alluding to, working with extreme groups and trying to bridge those divides in very volatile situations. And that magical feeling comes when I'm in a room with people, I'm with a group of people who are completely different from each other in every single way possible. Right. And there's something magical about that, because I know, and they all know, that if there wasn't an explicit convening of such a diverse group, these people would have never run into each other or interacted in a meaningful way, if not brought together in this sort of way. That if we just go about our lives and we connect with the people that we want to connect with, and we're a part of a community that reflects our values and identities, then we are never going to run into people who are completely different, who come from completely different walks of life, who are from completely different cultural backgrounds, geographical locations, political ideologies, religious philosophies, and so forth, including things like generation, right? Old people, young people, everyone in between. And when you have all of these people in a room sharing all of their different life experiences, their perspectives and opinions, and somehow we all find a way to get along and benefit and grow through these conversations, which at some time can be very difficult to navigate, that to me is a magical feeling, right up there with watching my baby goat being born, right up there with hiking up mountains and going into forests and streams, or getting married to my wife. That is such a, to me, that holding that diversity is an incredibly magical experience, and something that's really meaningful for me, and a really beautiful thing, because it's not something that naturally occurs, right? It's almost like a social law of physics. We tend to gravitate towards people who are just like us. It's easier, it's comfortable, and it's nice to be acknowledged by people who share our values and our common interests. So when we're able to consciously and deliberately meet with people who are different from us, that to me is a magical opportunity, because it's not something that we intentionally find ourselves in very often. And again, that's not a problem that birds of a feather flock together, right? It's what we naturally do, because it's a default way of operating. But when we meet people who are very different from us, that is truly magical in my experience. And so I'll just share a little bit about the previous job I did, where I had to work with this every single day. And this job was a project called Cure PNW. I think I mentioned it a little bit at the last talk here last year. And I was blessed by being in the program manager and coordinator position. So I was kind of the one who overseed this entire project and make sure that our goals and deliverables were fulfilled. And this project involved using what we call a public health approach to prevent political violence and extremism in the Pacific Northwest. And the public health approach involves reaching out to community members and people that we call credible messengers. And the role of the credible messenger is to connect with their community and respective social circle, and use their credibility and trust and social capital established with these people to change norms and narratives that might encourage violence, and to de-escalate people who might be on the verge of committing violence acutely, and to work with people on a long term to coach them and kind of social work with them in a way where their personal trauma or issues that might cause them to be violent or extreme are healed and overcome. And we would go out into the community and try to find these unique individuals. And then I would sneakily have coffee with them and say, hey, actually, would you like a job working for us? It pays this much, and this would be your, day-to-day work. And we would bring them onto the team, train them in all of these skills and our methodology, and then they would basically go out into the community, hang out with people, talk to them, have coffee dates, de-escalate if things were going to get out of control. And this was my day job. And the people that we had to hire to work with these groups were the most diverse, wide range ideology and identity groups you could imagine, right? We had military veterans who worked with conservative rural communities who were 80 years old. We had a young kind of Black Panther groups that were like in their 20s. We had anarchists who worked with Antifa in inner Portland. We had pastors who work with Christian nationalists in rural Washington. We had gunsmiths who work closely with the Proud Boys, and Jewish women who work with the Jewish community after October 7th. We had a trans woman who worked with the LGBTQ community. So we had 4 on the left and 4 on the right, and we would have meetings 3 times a week. One meeting was with the people on the left, one meeting was with people on the right, and then Friday we all were in the same room together, and somehow I would have to manage that and facilitate that whole thing. And there were challenges and there were bumps in the road, but it was really a magical experience. And what was so magical to me is whether we were able to prevent violence or not, which is a big thing to do over the geographic span of Portland to Olympia, whether we were successful in our mission or not. Everyone in the project told me later, after the project was over, how much they grew as individuals and how much of a special experience it was to meet people who were completely different from them, who they would have never encountered otherwise. And they said they learned so many good skills for themselves about tolerance, open-mindedness, communicating differently with people that you disagree with or are very different from, how to be more mindful of our words and language and how they might land with people that we disagree with. And even if these people didn't fully communicate after the project was over, just those encounters really stuck with them, right? And it was also really fun when we would go to really dicey protest events together and have a little huddle, be like, this is our strategy. So we're going to de-escalate people here who share our values that we can be credible with, right? So we had the Christian nationalists de-escalating far-right people. We had military veterans de-escalating Proud Boys. We had LGBTQ people and anarchists de-escalating Antifa and people on the far left and so forth. So that kind of team experience was really amazing. And all of us grew and learned a lot from that. And the last thing, a couple more things I'll mention that have been personal to me. As Rich said, my mom's a Buddhist minister. So I grew up in a Buddhist temple and Buddhist community, which was quite a great background to have growing up in Hawaii, being part of such a close, tightly knit community, Japanese Buddhist community. And throughout my life, I'm 33, throughout my life, I've bounced around through many different communities, a lot of spiritual communities and some religious communities, different political groups that I've worked with or been a part of over time. But the one kind of dissatisfaction that's always lingered in the back of my mind was that everyone in the communities pretty much all believe the same thing, right? I mean, that's the purpose of a community. They're all like-minded individuals. People sought out the community because they wanted to be with like-minded individuals. And I wasn't totally fulfilled in any of those environments. So what I had to do is I had to be a part of 10 different, 12, 15 different communities, all with different people, with different perspectives, different values and so forth, different ideologies. And I would get a little bit of something from each one. And then eventually I was able to cultivate a community where everyone could be in the same room together and getting that magical experience on a regular basis and watching that individual and social transformation take place. And that's been something that's been really meaningful to me as someone who's never found all of that in one place until the last several years. So I just want to share that personal story. And the last thing I'll mention as we start to wrap it up and open it up is I've come to take a lot of personal pride and joy in being a part of such diverse groups. It's been a real joy to be able to experience that and to share the positive experience of that with other people like you here. And one other thing I'll mention is that there are some people in my community groups where we talk about very contentious political issues, which are, of course, top of mind for a lot of people lately. You know, a lot of strong feelings, people of different racial or cultural backgrounds where they feel like their group is threatened or under attack. So there's a lot of very personal emotions and high stakes in some of these conversations that we have in some of my community groups. But what's amazing is that afterwards, they don't take themselves too seriously. It's almost as if while people are getting angry, they also are not taking themselves very seriously. And sometimes they'll apologize tongue in cheek or make fun of themselves after a 5-minute rant about something they're really pissed off about. And that's been an attitude that's been cultivated over time, right? We're able to express our emotions and feelings authentically and powerfully, but also in a way where there's a certain kind of detachment or self-reflection that comes with that. And I've seen people, including myself, transform in that direction where we can still be committed to our values and ideology and political or cultural philosophical goals, but learn to express them in a way where we are not able to, we don't take ourselves too seriously, we don't identify or get attached to our opinions or emotions too strongly. And that makes it a lot more fun for everyone else in the group, right? It's kind of like if you watch animals fight each other, they'll get really intense and they'll fight, and then after the fight's over, they'll kind of shake it off and just continue to go about doing whatever they're doing, right? One time I had to scare away some of my goats because they were abusing another goat, and I would go in with a spray bottle and like I would slap some of them. They have very hard skulls, so I would like slap them in the face or hit them in the head. And the next day they were back out wanting to cuddle and get petted and get lunch and, you know, food and water and all that stuff. So it's just there's kind of a forgetting about those things very quickly and being able to forgive and reconnect after those experiences. So I think that's part of the virtue and character development that we're trying to cultivate here with exploring disagreement and differences and embracing diversity of all kinds. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and would love to hear what you all think of this.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I will open it up to questions, but I have a couple reactions off the top. One is that one of the comments about our church community that particularly younger people have said to me is that one of their favorite things about this community, it's the most diverse group that they're part of, particularly among different ages. And they said, I would never be with people that age. And it's just, I love that. So I do appreciate the story of the magic. Um, but my question is, I'm going to put you more on the spot on this in that. So you work with extreme groups that are, in some cases, dangerous. And I want to get your advice. I think one of the most common questions that I get from people is, I'm I'm nice. The people on the other side of the debate are not. And they use the expression, we're bringing a knife to a gunfight, and we have to get meaner because they're mean, and they feel like they're being taken advantage of for being nice, and that the other side's really vicious. And I hear it from all sides, so it's not limited to one side saying it. Everybody kind of believes that. What do you say to somebody who says that because that they want to in other words, we need to get meaner, we need to get tougher, we need to be more aggressive if we're going to not because we want to, but because of our opposition. What is your response to that?
Yeah, great question. I think it's very tempting to fall into this tit for tat mentality or mutual escalation. So it's like if you're gonna go low, we're gonna go lower kind of a dynamic, which I think it tends to spiral out of control. So several things come to my mind. One is when I'm working with, let's say, very extreme people and they're yelling or they're saying very inflammatory things either towards me or to other people. I am not looking for mutuality, right? I'm not looking for them to listen to me. And personally, I don't have a very strong desire to share my own view or to be heard or to shove it down their throat or for them to acknowledge me, right? I feel happy to be in that listening position and really hear about their life experiences, their personal story. And honestly, for me, with extreme people, it's actually more interesting to talk to them than non-extreme people, because I'm more curious about how they arrived at an ideology that we would find to be crazy or irrational or really harmful. So there is there is that curiosity that I lead with that I feel like is able to make me feel better about the situation and get something out of talking to them. And the last thing I'll say, which we talk a lot about, is if your goal, it depends on what your goal is, right, in the conversation. So if the goal is to change someone's mind or to persuade them, escalating, going tit for tat, yelling at them is demonstrably and empirically the worst possible way you could engage, right? Because not only does the person shut down, but the research shows that they engage in what's called psychological reactance, which means they double down on their existing views harder and cement them more, the more aggressive you are towards them. So if you want to win hearts and minds and be persuasive, then we have to let go of that resentment or anger or even desire for a 50-50 thing. And what's really interesting too is a lot of dialogue and depolarization groups, like Braver Angels and other mainstream groups, one thing they really preach is to let go of your agenda and let go of trying to persuade people and just being there for the conversation, listen, share your view when it feels appropriate. But I've read a lot of books and have some experience trying to explicitly persuade people. Like, how can you become more persuasive, right? As a leader, as an advocate. And incidentally, all of the skills that have been empirically proved to make you more persuasive are the exact same skills I would use in de-escalation or mediation when my goal was not to persuade people, right? So the intention is different. The skills are the same. If you want to de-escalate people, make friends, or be persuasive, the same, like, universal, like, listen to people, calm yourself down, paraphrase them and acknowledge them, translate your own point of view into the language and values that they hold so you can connect with them on their own terms and their own turf instead of expecting them to jump into your frame of reference. And my favorite one too is you always continue asking questions, right? So what I'll do is sometimes even when de-escalating neo-Nazis or Antifa or whatever on the streets, standing in the sun on the sidewalk at a rally for 2 hours, listening to them and going back and forth. And I would then share my point of view, and then I would give pushback very gently or just share a different perspective. And then I would always end by saying, so that's what I believe. What do you think about it? Right? I've shared my perspective. I want to hear your reaction. I want to hear your thoughts. If you have pushback, I'm all ears. So it's not like I'm yelling at you and just trying to mic drop the conversation. I'm sharing my view and I'm handing it back to you and keeping that flow of dialogue going. So I don't know if that got to what you're asking, Rich, but those are just some things that came to mind.
It did get to my question, Ryan. In fact, I'm glad this is recorded because I think you just rattled off three very powerful pieces of wisdom that I want to make sure I read again and listen to again. But just a couple of things. One, I want to reiterate them. You're Buddha, you're raised Buddhist. We're a Christian community. We're called to be peacemakers. So you said, one, my goal in that situation is not my opinion. I'm trying to de-escalate. I'm trying to do something else. If we're committed to following Jesus, who is calling us to be peacemakers, our opinion in the moment is less important than de-escalating. And so it's not a debate sometimes. And so I really appreciated that. Two, you said get curious. And I think that's a really incredible tip. That just be like, instead of you believe this and you're a horrible person, it's think to yourself, why do they believe this? I'm going to be curious, and it could be very interesting. And and then at the end, I want to get this all written out because it was just really, really good. Really good points about de-escalating. Do you remember what your third point was? Because it was really
I
good.
lost track some along the way.
We'll have it on the video, but you made some really profound insights, and I want to watch again. Okay, now we have Reverend Glenn is next, and then we have Ellie. So let's go to Glenn first.
Thank you for the opportunity of speaking. I'm a United Methodist pastor that works in a rural area of Michigan, and we have a small congregation. I've been a pastor there for 6 years. What's unique about these folks is that as I've gotten acquainted with them, is that you can divide the congregation right down the middle between those that are very conservative minded and those that are very progressive. The one thing that they acknowledge especially is we need each other. There's only 24 members of this church. We'll see 17 or 18 people in worship. They're dedicated to doing what they're doing, but they acknowledge that everyone is necessary for this church to continue. And we just celebrated 150 years of existence. We'd hate to think that this would be the generation we'd have to close. And we're determined that that's not going to happen. I think the secret to our success is that we do not insist that others think the way that we think. For those that are very conservative, politically speaking, they're generally speaking also very conservative when it comes to biblical and spiritual issues. And then the others would like to see more action or activity toward liberal kinds of matters, both politically speaking and in terms of their biblical understandings. But I think that it's probably, of all the churches I've served, one of the most loving places I've ever experienced. And so we're willing to let each other have, without coming up with a list of saying, in order to be a member of this church, you have to think this way, or you have to be committed to this. And we're willing to not insist that others be like ourselves, but we know that we're disagreeing with one another, but we don't, as a friend of mine says, we're not disagreeable about that. So I just kind of wanted to raise my hand and say, I'm already a part of a community that seems to be succeeding in that kind of endeavor.
That's wonderful, Glenn. Thank you. And I'll just mention really quickly, what really stuck with me about what you shared is that when people say we need each other, I think that's really a great sign, right? Where people would feel like if they were to leave the community, what would they be missing out? Like there'd almost be a sense of grief, like I've lost something invaluable here with the composition of people here. And I think that's a really wonderful feeling that people have. So thank you. Also, my wife is from Flint, Michigan. So nice to hear about the Michigan connection.
Yeah, I know we have other questions and I want to get to them, but what I appreciated, Glenn, in that story was that you also concluded by saying it was one of the most loving communities, and yet it's divided 50-50. It's a small group divided 50-50 politically. And what that just shows is you can have very different views on how to accomplish things and be loving and be a loving community. I just want to highlight that because right now I would say most faith communities are not would not tolerate that sort of ideological diversity. People are picking their pastor very often to agree with their politics in many cases in a community. So I admire what you're doing there. The next question is from Ellie. She can either say it out loud. Often Ellie is traveling and she puts it into the chat. So I think that might be why it's in the chat. And so I will read it out loud unless she chimes in. So she says, related to Rich's question, how do you interact with groups when there may be genuine differences in degree of hate, power, and or violence between two groups? For example, trans activists versus anti-LGBTQ groups that are extreme ends may promote violence. This isn't to say one group is totally good or bad, but they may fall into aggressor-victim role societally if one group traditionally has more power. How do you address this? Great question, Ellie.
Yeah, great question. So I can just share from some of my experiences. And I think the first thing I'll say is if there is a real threat of physical violence acutely, then always safety first, right? Know the situation, have situational awareness, and do what you need to do to be safe. That being said, one of my favorite colleagues and people I really found a lot of joy working with was one of the trans women on my team who work a lot with the LGBTQ community. And during Pride month in was it June or July something, we were extremely busy driving around the state and going to different events where we received a lot of harassment, a lot of escalation, a lot of counter protests in all the ways that Ellie had described. And this woman I worked with, she was absolutely amazing in staying centered and not being phased. In some ways, she was so enthusiastic to jump into the deep end. Her was one person in her late 50s going into a hostile group of 50 people. I would actually tell her, like, maybe take me with you, or this might not be, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this, she was that willing to talk to different people. And she had a very interesting take on the power thing dynamic. And me and her have a lot of philosophical conversations, because she's actually a spiritual and mindfulness and non-dual spiritual teacher, and she has quite a wonderful presence. And we talked about many different forms of power. And she was really illuminating to me, because she would say that, sure, from a historical perspective or a majority minority perspective, there are all sorts of power dynamics that are present, right? That we feel viscerally or we feel collectively. But when you get to a more individual level in a one-on-one conversation, the power dynamics become very complex. And she would say that, so a lot of the people she would talk to have a lot of anger and a lot of trauma, and to a certain extent, for really hateful people, a lot of ignorance. And so she said, with her holding space for people, her being calm, her being not only psychologically healthy, but very spiritually illuminated, she had more power in those situations, right? She actually steered the conversation. She was the one who helped them through a kind of Socratic questioning process slash subtle therapy session, coaching session, counseling session. She was helping people see themselves more deeply and clarify their own thoughts and feel heard. And that's a tremendous position of power, almost in the same way that a therapist has some power over the client. So there comes a certain responsibility with that. So even on an identity level or political level, you could say, yeah, she absolutely has less power. But on a personal level, with all of her individual qualities and the way we relate, she would always say she has more power, and therefore felt very confident working in these situations. So yeah, that's what first comes to my mind, but I'll think about that more.
That's a great answer, Ryan. And what your theme today is the agency of the peacemaker, that we have power as peacemakers, which is really powerful. Okay, we have three more questions at least. And so I'm going to ask Chris if you can be really brief, and I'll get to the other two. So Chris, if your question?
Yes, I actually have to say that, first of all, I am not a good mediator, and I am not a very good peacemaker, but I have spent my entire life in education. And if you spend a lot of time with junior and senior high school students, you learn how to be this really quiet presence who sort of helps people understand each other. And so I would like to just say two things. And unfortunately, they're going to speak about the Swedenborgian Church as an entity. Uh, the Swedenborgian Church is not so very large in numbers of physical bodies, but it's very broad in terms of people who are connected. I had an opportunity, I'm going to call it that, an opportunity at one point to serve in the absence. I was vice president of this whole denomination, and the president was unable to attend what we
Chris,
call annual convention. So,
Chris,
okay,
Chris, can you ask a question?
yes, I will. What I'm going to say is not so much a question as to acknowledge that it is possible to de-escalate escalate something with just a very calm group of people meeting, even if you're not really schooled in doing this, as long as you get them on either side. We had a gathering where a church wanted to make a huge political statement, and we had a group that was not in the position to receive that political statement. And so it was my job, in a position I had never assumed, to move into the middle and literally stand there and figure out how to get these people to connect. And I just want to thank you and your presentation for giving me actually tools at this point in my life, actually to understand how it was we managed to do that. And it was to see each other's points of view, to create that the points of connection, and understand that if this continued, it would destroy an entire fabric. And
Hmm.
so I just wanted to say thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris.
Yeah. And Chris, knowing your teaching years, but also watching you as president, were a very effective mediator in a number of circumstances that I saw. Katerina, do you want to read your question?
Yeah, sure. Ryan, thank you so much for your wisdom. As I mentioned in my comment, I just want to hear more from you on the relationship between faith and politics here in the US. And would you say faith is a sort of division or unity in our country, and how we as a church can begin to navigate that and maybe do more of what Glenn has been doing in his community?
Yeah, thank you, Katerina. This is obviously a very big question and probably a little bit above my pay grade. I know people are experts in this, but I'll just say really quickly, more experiences is one of the biggest joys I had working on the project Cure PNW that I shared with was working with different community groups that we had sent micro grants to for them to implement their own programming and their own scope to achieve goals of depolarization, bridge building, and violence prevention. And one of my favorite community groups, we work with 8, was a large evangelical church in Southwest Portland. And the pastor at Andy, I just absolutely loved him. And they had some very big disagreements. They were a Foursquare church, and they had some very, very big disagreements about all kind of theological and political issues and how they should be involved in politics as a church and how to label that and what to put on the website, all of these kind of conflicts. And what Andy basically pioneered this virtue of disagreement approach, and he called it cultivating the right posture towards conflict. And we had called it space for grace, was a term that we coined, right? So we're holding space individually and collectively, and allowing that grace to kind of flow through and to kind of envelop the situation in a way where we can treat each other with love and have humility about our own views and respect for other people. And I'll just say, I think the churches and religious communities are uniquely positioned to bridge these divides. I think part of what Glenn was saying too, in my experience, is that when you have a higher calling or something that transcends the political world, that transcends the kind of messy world of human affairs, that can act as a real spiritual anchor that gets people to see the bigger picture and kind of a more cosmic, perspective rather than getting lost in the details of whatever's happening in the news. And the community members have an incentive to hold it all together, right? We're all in it together, and I don't want to become alienated or leave the church or have people become distanced from my fellow congregants because of some kind of political divide or something. And some of the biggest grief work we had to do at some of these churches was during COVID, where a large portion of the congregation left over mask or vaccine or whatever the issue was at the time to another church. And they were so sad that these relationships in the community were broken apart, even if they were friends personally afterwards. There's something about losing that chunk of the community that was really a big source of grief for people, even though the individual relationships are important. So I think that creates an added incentive to hold things together at the community level, on top of just a personal relationship, if that makes sense.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful answer. Again, I'm gonna have to watch this video again because there's so many gems. The next question is, well, I mean, and just to observe it, there's a theory right now, as you know, Ryan, that with the fall of the church, with the failure of the church and its diminishment, that people are looking to their political parties to fill that gap. And that's why we've gotten so vicious, because political parties cannot fill the spot that faith can fill and a faith-based community can fill. It's just because there's no higher value but winning. And in faith, as we saw in Glenn's church, there was a higher value. So I want to go to Matthias's question, also known as Matt's iPhone, but we know it's Matthias because he told us. So he says, thank you so much. Something I'm curious about. In your experience, is there a common factor that is more likely to lead people to hold more extreme views? Socioeconomic level, isolation? Is it related to personality? Do you have any insights, Ryan, in your work with with extreme folks? What are the factors that lead people to this? Any ideas?
Yeah, great question. I actually talked about this recently. So to contrast, the nonprofit that was the host of this project called Cure Violence Global has historically worked with a lot of gang violence in like Chicago and Baltimore. And part of their framework for dealing with gang violence was a heavy focus on socio economic material conditions. So the outreach workers would patrol the streets and say, hey, what's up, brother? Have you eaten today? Do you want to go get a cheeseburger? How's your living situation? Do you have a roof over your head? And that would be a big part of the de-escalation and community building work. In the extremism world, we have not experienced that very much. There are a lot of people who are very well off, who are married and kids and have a job that pays 6 figures, being a contractor or whatever, and they're members of the Proud Boys. So I think there's several reasons why that happens. One is there are unresolved personal issues that people have, even going back to childhood. But instead of reframing it as an opportunity for personal growth and healing and working through it with a pastor or a therapist or introspection or meditation or whatever, they turn it into a political ideology. So their anger and pain is projected outwards towards the world into a political framework instead of focusing that attention back on themselves. And so what I would try to coach people when working with these people is what I would call repersonalization and de-ideologization, right? So you take the ideology that crystallizes their hatred and anger that's turned outward back into them as a person and seeing how they can grow. So that's part of the virtue of disagreement theme. I think the other one is some people in mediation, we call them high conflict personalities. So high conflict personalities are people who are engaged in conflict, not because they're looking for a resolution, but because they get something out of the conflict itself. It's a form of thrill seeking or adventure seeking. And I think that's another part of going to these protests or engaging in violence or doing really kind of edgy things in the community is people are very bored and feel stagnated. We have a very rich, modern, post-industrial, well-off first world country, and people feel a sense of loss of meaning and a loss of like the hunt, right? People feel, because it's like 99% men in these groups, especially on the far right. And I think people are looking for some kind of stimulation and some kind of excitement and some kind of challenge. And so getting themselves into these situations and joining a group where they then adopt the ideology is part of fulfilling that. So I think as a society, we have to find ways to productively channel that kind of energy, especially for a lot of young men who get very frustrated for whatever reasons and need an outlet, so they don't go and do extreme violent things to people or join groups or ideologies that are really bad.
Beautifully said, and great insights. Very, very specific insights. I would just add, Ryan, in my experience, I wonder if you think this is true, that people often feel you dig and they're very disrespected at some point. They felt somewhere where they were like incredibly humiliated or disrespected, and this is their way back. Is that?
That's absolutely, yeah. Feeling disrespected and disowned and kind of brushed aside. And so it's almost a form of like virtuous revenge or something.
It has a kind of like a revenge feel. I feel like that's driving a lot of our politics. Well, Ryan, you were amazing. This was an amazing discussion, and like I said, there's so many gems in particularly in this Q&A, and I'm going to have to watch it again. Really good stuff. A Space for Grace. We'll have to remember that one. But really great job. So glad you could share your wisdom with us, and I'm so glad to work with you.